In the early morning hours of January 1st, 2017, most people were celebrating the promise of a new year. But the new year held no promise for 22-year-old Xavier Wimes, no promise except the certainty of suffering. Because in those pre-dawn hours, Xavier Wimes was faced with two choices: remain in the apartment where he was hiding and die, or jump from the third-floor window and try to escape. Xavier Wimes chose his only hope for survival. He leaped. When he opened the window, he was likely met with a cold, crisp winter air. Seconds later, he crashed to the ground 3 stories below. The impact of the fall snapped and broke his right ankle, and despite this horrible injury, he managed to get up from the ground. He got up, and he limped away toward the parking lot. He limped toward the parking lot, hoping to find a way out, hoping to find help, hoping for rescue. He never made it to the parking lot, and he never found the deliverance he was looking for, because as Xavier Wimes limped toward the parking lot, his attackers were closing in. Any hope he had of escaping ended when the first shot rang out and dropped him to the ground. The man he knew then stood over him, aiming a .45 caliber pistol and unloaded round after round after round. Xavier Wimes was killed after being shot more than 10 times at close range. Xavier Wimes was executed in cold blood by members of his own gang. They decided that morning that he no longer deserved to be a part of the gang and, therefore, no longer deserved to live. And the man that held that .45 caliber pistol and pulled the trigger over and over and over again is seated right there. His name is Delvin Curry. Why was Xavier Wimes murdered? The answer is simple. Xavier Wimes violated the code of the street. He violated the law of the gang world he lived in. When you hear the code of the street or the law of the gang world, you might be thinking survival of the fittest, eat or be eaten, kill or be killed. And to some degree, that's true. However, the code of the street, the law of the gang world, isn't every man for himself. Gangs derive their power from the collective, from each member doing his part for the whole. The street code or gang law requires unwavering loyalty to the gang and demands respect of its members. Xavier Wimes lived in a world ruled by that unwritten code, and violations of that code came with harsh consequences. Xavier Wimes violated that code, and he paid dearly. You'll learn that before the New Year's Eve party, this defendant mocked Xavier's murdered cousin on social media. Xavier's cousin had been a member of a rival gang, and you'll hear about how Xavier responded to that insult. He responded by showing up to the gang's New Year's Eve party in the town's gardens and striking this defendant in the head with a bottle. When Wimes hit the defendant, he knocked him to the floor in a heap in front of everyone. Wimes disrespected this defendant, his gang brother, in front of a bunch of women and his other gang brothers. This act was unforgivable. It signified Wimes choosing his cousin, the rival gang member, over his own gang. A choice for the opposition meant there was no way out but death. In an instant, Xavier Wimes went from being a member of the gang to a member of the opposition. In an instant, he was the enemy. And for his transgression, Xavier Wimes was given a death sentence, one that was carried out swiftly and violently and without mercy. May it please the court, counsel, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the Xavier Wimes murder is a particularly brutal example of how the CBL, BFL, conducted its business. But his homicide represents the nature of their conspiracy and how the gang operated. While Delvin Curry is the man seated at the defense table, and make no mistake, his actions will be highlighted during the course of this trial, this case is fundamentally about the CBL, BFL gang as an organization, what it did as a whole through all of its members. The murder of Xavier Wimes was one of the many crimes committed by the BFL, CBL gang. The gang didn't begin by committing murders. The gang started much smaller, much more innocently. But it's important to know how the gang began to understand why we are here today in federal court. CBL, which you'll learn stands for City of Brotherly Love, Cash Bin Long, and other more crude versions beginning with the letters CBL, and BFL, which stands for Brothers for Life, Be Forever Loyal, and other more crude versions beginning with the letters BFL, are two groups that were originally formed by school-age boys. The members of CBL and BFL forged friendships in the neighborhood they all grew up in the schools they attended together, and on the youth football teams they played for. The two groups, CBL and BFL, began as cliques like you find in any other school. But as time passed, as their members got older, these two groups evolved and developed into a violent street gang. You'll learn that central to the gang dynamics in Buffalo is the neighborhood you grow up in. Where you grow up often defines you. Where you grow up and who you grow up with defines your allegiance. CBL, BFL, this defendant's gang, was no different. The gang originated in the Towne Garden Apartments, and its territory included many of the streets in and around the apartment complex. It is an area in the city of Buffalo referred to collectively as Down the Way or Downtown. Both CBL and BFL claim Down the Way as their territory. Down the Way is on the east side of Buffalo, and its territory is bounded roughly by Genesee Street to the north, Seneca Street to the south, Michigan Avenue to the west, and Stanton Street to the east. The Towne Garden Apartments served as the hub of activity down the way. CBL, BFL, was one enterprise operating out of one neighborhood. The distinctions between CBL and BFL are few. You'll hear that the CBL guys were a little bit older, and they prioritized drug dealing and making money over drive-by shootings. CBL supplied the younger BFL members with drugs, advice, and weapons. The younger BFL members were influenced by CBL and were used as enforcers and shooters for the gang. They all hung out together every day in the Towne Gardens. What will matter in this case is not what they called themselves, but how they operated. The members of CBL, BFL acted as a single enterprise. As CBL and BFL members grew up and began to assert themselves, so grew their feuds. So what began as rivalries with groups of boys from other neighborhoods and other schools over girls and sports, feuds which were often fueled and fanned by boastful rhetoric on social media like Facebook and Snapchat, initially resulted in fistfights. And in those early years, CBL and BFL members started selling marijuana to make money to buy nice sneakers or nice clothes. Now, if CBL and BFL had kept their feuds at fistfights and only sold marijuana, we wouldn't be here today. This case would have never drawn the attention of the FBI or the U.S. Attorney's Office. But as I said earlier, the gang evolved. By 2015, the gang's fistfights escalated into full-fledged war with their many rivals. This urban warfare involved a cache of illegal firearms, hails of bullets, and spent shell casings, and casualties on all sides. The gang's battles played out in neighborhoods, corner stores, and public roadways throughout Buffalo. CBL-BFL was involved in numerous shoot-on-sight rivalries, meaning if the gang saw a rival gang member walking around, they shot at them. And if their rivals saw them out walking around, they were shot at. And the gang's drug dealing evolved too. From selling small amounts of marijuana, the gang graduated to cocaine, crack cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, and fentanyl analogs, such as butyrylfentanyl and fentanyl. Instead of selling little dime bags and hustling on the corner, gang members were becoming suppliers to the hustlers and making real money. Instead of new sneakers, gang members were buying real estate and cars. Before I go on, before I tell you about some of the specific events and specific proof you'll hear and see in this case, I want to tell you more generally about CBL and BFL, how it operated, how it worked, what its purpose was, and what its objectives were. There are essentially two guiding principles, two core values that formed and gave life to the CBL-BFL enterprise: loyalty and respect. Loyalty meant loyalty to the neighborhood you grew up in, loyalty to your brothers, your fellow gang members. And respect? Respect was earned, not given freely. Respect was earned by building a reputation. This refers both to the reputation of the gang as a whole and of its individual members. Respect was earned by putting in work, and you could put in work in many ways, and you'll hear about what that meant. In order to earn respect, in order to maintain, increase your reputation, you committed bold acts, and you didn't do it in secret. You told your gang brothers about it, and you let your rivals know, oftentimes on social media. That's how CBL-BFL grew and promoted its image, its brand. It's the way the gang grew its notoriety and maintained and increased its power. Respect and reputation was earned, maintained, and increased in two fundamental ways: by getting money and by getting it in blood. CBL-BFL gang members got money by dealing drugs and robbing people. They got it in blood by committing acts of violence, by fighting, by shooting, by killing. a campaign of social media posts on Facebook, Snapchat, and Twitter, and a series of rap videos uploaded to YouTube were used to promote the gang. Social media and rap videos and lyrics were used to display gang affiliations, to brandish firearms, to display quantities of currency and narcotics, and show participation in violent acts. They used social media to antagonize the gang's enemies, boast of their prowess, increase their street profile, and legitimize their success. The CBL BFL gang was continually engaged in the distribution of heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, cocaine base, marijuana, and other controlled substances. Typically, older gang members obtained controlled substances and supplied street-level amounts, typically a few grams of drugs at a time, to other gang members and associates in the areas controlled by the gang. CBL BFL gang members also frequently set up drug spots, including indoor and outdoor locations for gang members to distribute controlled substances. Members of the gang maintained close associations between members, and many were, in fact, relatives. The members of the gang shared a mutually beneficial relationship, which involved the possession and distribution of narcotics and obtaining, maintaining, and sharing firearms. Members of the gang used violence, threats, and intimidation to defend their territory against rivals and anyone deemed to be a threat to the gang. An attack on one member typically resulted in retaliation by the gang. As I said before, the Towne Gardens served as a central hub for members of the gang. Many lived in the Towne Gardens, and many housing units within the Towne Gardens were used to store firearms and narcotics. Parking lots and business fronts adjacent to the Towne Gardens were utilized by members of the gang to sell drugs. In order to enforce the authority of the gang and defend themselves, CBL BFL gang members maintained a steady supply of firearms. Certain members and associates of the enterprise carried and discharged those firearms. These enforcers, shooters, retaliated with deadly force against the threats of encroachment and violence from rival gangs or individuals. CBL BFL gang members also threatened witnesses who they suspected they might testify or provide information to law enforcement about the crimes they committed. The CBL BFL gang recruited new members through friendships and familiar associations with the current member. Some members were permitted to claim gang memberships or represent the gang after being permitted to hang around the gang for a period of time and prove themselves by displaying a willingness to fight, sell drugs, or shoot at rival gang members on behalf of the gang. The purposes of the CBL BFL gang were many. The gang sought to promote and enhance the enterprise and its members and associates by distributing narcotics, maintaining stash houses for use, manufacturing, and sale of controlled substances, and the possession, use, and sale of firearms. Also to promote and enhance the enterprise through members' use of social media, and to boast of the enterprise's activities and to intimidate rivals. The gang sought to preserve and protect the power, territory, and representation of the enterprise and its members through intimidation, violence, threats of violence, assaults, and acts involving murder, robbery, and attempted murder. They sought to place victims, potential victims, witnesses, potential witnesses, and others in fear of the enterprise, its members and associates through violence and threats of violence. The gang sought to prevent acts of violence from being perpetrated against the enterprise, its members, and their associates. The gang sought to commit acts of violence against members and associates of rival gangs, and retaliate against the rivals when members of the enterprise were attacked. And the gang sought to generate and maximize profits, reputation, and memberships of the enterprise through a variety of illegal activity, including robbery and drug trafficking.